Hi, everyone. Welcome to another book discussion between Unerased Book Club and the Ann Arbor District Library. Tonight, we are discussing a graphic novel called Almost American Girl, and this is by Robin Haque. And before we get started, let's quickly go around and introduce ourselves. I'll start. I'm Lucy. I work at the library as a youth tech. I do programming, including a lot of these wonderful book discussions. I am a white female, 50 years old, with green glasses, shoulder-length brown hair, and some watercolor photos behind me.
Hi, I'm Emily. I also work at the library. I am a librarian. I manage the kids' fiction collection, but I mostly do programming for adults. I am a white woman in my mid-30s. I've got long, wavy, reddish hair. I'm wearing a blue and white striped shirt and sitting in front of a mostly white wall with a print of Matisse's goldfish behind me. And I just noticed my Dutch oven that I forgot to take out of the shop.
And my name is Jacob Gorski. I am an employee at Ann Arbor District Library, where I work in the outreach department. I'm a 29-year-old male wearing a button-up t-shirt. I'm bearded and I have blonde hair. And I'm sitting in front of an unfortunately white wall. Kind of boring.
My name is Amanda. I'm also a library technician and youth services at the library. And I'm a middle-aged white female with medium length wavy brown hair. And I'm sitting next to a bookshelf and a white wall, all sorts of plants around.
My name is Krista, and I'm a desk clerk for the Ann Arbor Library. And I'm 40, have short blonde hair, and I'm white, and I'm sitting before a wall of books.
Hi, folks. I'm Fatema Haque. I am one of the co-facilitators of Unerased Book Club. I am a Bangladeshi American woman in her mid-30s with long black hair, and I have a blurred background.
And hey everyone, I'm Sheela. I'm the founder and other co-facilitator of Unerased Book Club. I'm an Indian American woman in my early 30s with medium, longish black hair, wearing glasses, a neon yellow sweatshirt, and behind me is a backdrop of a scenery in Sri Lanka. And I'm so excited that we're having this conversation, as I am every month. But before we get started, I want to just give a brief synopsis of this book. So for people who are following along who haven't had a chance to read it, you're not completely thrown into conversation that you have no context for. So Almost American Girl is a graphic novel by Robin Haque, and it is about a Korean girl who moves to Alabama in her early teens, at around 14, and because her mom gets remarried. And it is about her journey in understanding what's going on around her, figuring out assimilation versus just being, and her journey through art into feeling more comfortable in the US. So with that brief introduction, I would love to open it up to everyone and just ask, what were your thoughts after finishing the book?
Well, I'll start. I loved this. Oh, sorry. I love this. This is my second reading of this graphic novel, and I loved it just as much. One thing that struck me, I remember the first time I read it, but this time especially, is just how well this book shows the total isolation of a language barrier, and just how, it's just really striking in this book that without a piece of that piece, without understanding the language around you, you just become completely withdrawn and you're completely cut off, and how essential it is to be able to communicate.
I want to second that. I was not expecting to feel this way. I was so deeply moved by this book because of how the author lays out this emotion of loneliness and how they are isolated. It was the sort of book that I finished reading and it was like, I would like to be a better person in the world. I thought the art was amazing. I really enjoyed let me say everything about this book. But I was so moved. I'm still kind of reeling.
I also loved this book. I thought, especially thinking back to that, the struggles that most people have around 14, 15 with figuring out who you are. It was both very relatable on that sense, and then realizing, oh my goodness, how much more complicated everything was for Robin. I think that the graphic novel was a really great format for showing that, because you really, it's like that classic writing show, don't tell. She didn't say, oh, I'm so lonely. But she didn't need to, because we saw her try to communicate and be unable to. And then the joy I felt when she started to find connections. It was just, I really appreciate being able to be both put in her shoes and both have a little bit of, what is it? Empathy is when you have felt it before, and sympathy is when you haven't, but you start to see in it. Having both of those emotions kind of all woven together. It was pretty well wrapped by the end, but at the same time, I also would love for this to be an author who continues to make graphic memoir, just because I loved her style. I loved the way that she told the story with both pictures and words. And I care about her. So I also want to know what's next, other than obviously becoming a writer and graphic novelist.
I also echo what most people have said. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. It had been on my to-read list for a while, and I even checked it out a time or two from the library. So I was really happy to grab this and read it for this discussion. Of course, I read it within one sitting, and it was just delightful. I think I read it in 2 sittings. It's just great front to back. I love the illustrations. I like how the tones of the color of the pages told, whether they were in Korea versus being in the United States. I just love following her journey. And I was also drawn to reading this one and discussing today because there's a lot of really great graphic memoirs that have been slowly coming out. I feel like they have been even more, there's been more the past 10 or 15 years. And I just think there are some really phenomenal ones. And I think it's a great way to get a glimpse into a perspective of a person, no matter what their experiences are. I think it's a really cool way to get to know a human. And this one too, with just her experience of coming to the country for the first time and getting used to things. I was thoroughly enjoy it. And I'm glad to be here to talk about it today.
Yeah, I was really struck too by everything everybody said, but also how universal art is, because that's how she starts to connect to people. And that's also how we as readers are connecting to her, especially through the language barrier. And I also repeatedly struck me how forgiving and understanding of her mother she is, when from an outside point of view, what her mother does is pretty drastic repeatedly, and kind of harmful too. So that really struck me, that I don't know if so much it was her looking back or if it was her actually in the moment being understanding of her mother.
I would echo what everybody else says and just say I really enjoyed reading this, especially because I moved to America when I was 9. So I was still very young and was able to pick up the language super quickly. But I remember kids who would move while in high school when they would immigrate to America. And so Bangladeshi kids in my high school. And, I saw the way that they were kind of ostracized even by us, Bengalis, right? We would just separate ourselves from them because we were oh, they don't actually understand the context yet, and I remember being a really mean kid because that's what teenagers are. You don't quite understand. So I was a mean kid who would go along with everybody else and make fun of the fact that they wouldn't wear proper winter clothes, or probably because they hadn't gotten around to purchasing it, or that they hadn't picked up on the fact that you shouldn't smell like curry in school and all of these things. And it was just, so I found her experience, detailing her isolation and inability to adjust because of the language barriers and all, my youth reflected from the perspective of those that I probably harmed when I was younger. And I really appreciated seeing that. And I don't think I have read immigration narratives that are from that vantage point of someone who like has such a strong tie to their home country, and then to like move to America and feel lost and not free, because I think that was the opposite of that, because for her, like her entire life was in South Korea, and she had friends and she had social life and she had all of these things, and they had all disappeared when she moved to America. Yeah.
There's two things that strike me with everyone's reflections. First is the visualization of loneliness and not explicitly stating it when, and just thinking about it in this current moment. The Surgeon General has released this long report talking about how loneliness is an epidemic in this country. And there's the first way of getting out of the loneliness epidemic is for people to be able to have the tools to name loneliness and recognize that they need more connections, whether it's virtual or in person, and finding those ways out. And this book really highlights how you don't know it if you're in it, and you don't have the language to talk about it. The second thing that really sticks out to me is the idea that the overwhelming homogeneity, both of being in Korea as a Korean and then being in the US, and how super segregated this country is. And so it's very easy to be in a very white town, like where it seems Robin ended up. And because she isn't part of that homogenous culture, she feels even more isolated. But if she's part of the homogenous culture in Korea, she doesn't notice that that there are other ways that people are made to feel left out. And she does see it with her mother as a single mother and how she's pretty ostracized. But as a teenager, it's very hard to put two and two together, that like ostracization will always happen. There will always be people who want to marginalize others based on very like any different type of diversity or any variable of diversity. So those are my initial reactions to this conversation, not even to the book. I read it for the first time a few years ago, I think when it first came out in 2020. And when Fatema actually picked this one for the reading for May, and I was like, oh, delightful to read this again. And so I'm really happy to hear how you all are reacting to it, whether it's the first, second, or third time you're reading it.
I also want to mention something that Jacob said about like the colors and the pages. I think it reminded me of the way that last year when we read The Magic Fish and how that use of color changed. I hadn't even noticed it until you said it, that there was that color differentiation similar to, and I guess maybe this is a comic book or a graphic novel convention. I don't know, but yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
I thought it was helpful when reading it too, that it would go back to the sepia, like sort of sepia tones when she's going back in time, and then you're like, oh, okay, this is a memory. I know this because the color. So it's a good tool.
And I think tools like that, though, thankfully, less and less often these days, we are having to fight the argument that graphic novels are a form of literature and a form of art. But back, 10, 15 years ago, when they were starting to hit more of a mainstream, that was an argument that libraries especially were having to make, that, we're spending our book budget on this. And I think looking at those various storytelling conventions that only work in this mix of the art and the words together, things like color signifying time change or signifying mood are all just great ways to highlight the little differences that really elevate a graphic novel. And gosh, yes, of course, they're literature and they're art, and they deserve spaces in people's home libraries and their community libraries.
And I think too, when you're reading a graphic novel, you are immersed in the images, but you're also following the dialogue. And I also like how there's different forms of notation on the cells. Like you can have just an information, and then you can also have dialogue. And I think, was it this one? where the Korean was actually, yeah, so the Korean is actually in a different color, the word bubbles. The words that are spoken in Korean are one color, and the words that are spoken in English are another color. So it's small conventions like that that I think really follow a reader. And I think it's really great for people who are like, oh, I can't read graphic novels, I can't follow it. That was me like 10 years ago. And with these kinds of devices within a book, you're able to follow the story, you follow the cells, you get the background information with the notes, but then you're also, when you're reading it, for this, it's very helpful to know, like when someone's speaking Korean, because sometimes some of the characters go between English and Korean, and it kind of gives a little bit of insight into their personality, or like when they think it's a good time to use Korean or not Korean, or English or not English. So I think it's wonderful. I think it's such a special thing. And even if a book is, or a graphic novel is like all black and white, there's the use of lightness and darkness. Is, I think I read the Laurie Halse Anderson book Speak is so dark, and the page where there was like brutal things happening, the cells got really, really dark, like so much black, and you could just feel the pain and the tension of what was happening on the pages. And it's just black and white. It's marker and a pen and an image. And I think that's one of the most moving and cool things about a graphic novel, especially one that's telling someone's personal story. Like this story is so personal to her, and telling the story of her mother and how their lives were. I think it's wonderful. So.
What you said reminded me also of, as Robin is learning more English, or it's somebody speaking English and she knows this word, and this word, and the words she doesn't know are squigglies. That was so cool. And then as the book progressed, less squigglies. But sometimes the sentence would be a full sentence, and the one word she needed to know for it to make sense was a squiggly. It was such a unique way to explain or show language acquisition and what it means to somebody who is learning a second language in America. That was, I thought, was such a small detail that showed me so much.
And we as readers couldn't understand it either because it was a squiggly. So like we were very much in her shoes because of that. Yeah. So I brought this up a little about we read a lot of immigrant stories, obviously, in this book club. And I'm curious, like, how does this experience, her experience of immigration compare to others that you've read?
I think it's interesting getting it from the perspective of a young teenager, because you're in this weird place where you have more agency than you would as a young child, but perhaps not as much as someone either choosing to immigrate or someone who just happens to be immigrating as an adult and so are needing to make their own decisions. And I think it made me think about family relations, which made me think about, what was it, Mother Ocean, Father Nation, or maybe vice versa, those descriptors, but the parent-child relationship and how complicated those are. I think, Krista, you touched on it a little bit, that, the relationship with her mom could potentially be very dicey. And in times it is, the fact that she thought she was coming on vacation. And yes, maybe her mom hadn't 100% decided that she was going to marry this man and stay there, but clearly that was somewhat premeditated. You could see that completely destroying a relationship, but perhaps because they were the two into the world. And while these were very different, tricky relationships than the parent-child relationships in, now I'll say it the other way, is it Mother Nation, Father Ocean? No, that didn't sound right. Anyhow, it was the similar complicated, where nothing was all good and nothing was all bad, which I suppose is how our relationships really work. I think it was in the afterword, or perhaps in an epilogue, but where she wrote about her mother not initially wanting to be a part of the project. And I can't imagine the story without her mother in it. I mean, obviously she was a key player, so kind of needed to, but the complications in their relationship also gave the story a greater depth. And I don't know, I'm also always a sucker for family stories, and this certainly qualified as one.
A few I've been reading a ton lately, but a few books before I read this one. I read the youth middle grade fiction novel, Other Words for Home, about a young girl and her mother who were leaving Syria to come to Ohio. And in my mind, like, you know, a week and a half after reading this one, and then a week before I read the other one, like Other Words for Home was really cool for me because the girl in that is around 12, 13. So it's a similar experience of coming to a new country. She's being bullied by kids at school. She doesn't speak the language. She's trying to make those connections. And I really love the point of view of her point of view. And it was like one of the first things I've read from a young person's point of view of what it is like. And so I really liked seeing this person, you know, a couple years later, you know. So I think there's some really great novels or memoirs that are done really well to kind of give others that experience, that they haven't experienced firsthand. So in reading these, I'm able to think about some students that I had in some of my classes and what they would have been going through, you know, when they were 12, 13, 14, not speaking the language, that kind of thing.
And in a lot of these other immigration memoirs we've read in this book club, the person has some idea as to why they are moving to a new country. And what was so one of many things that made this story so interesting and layered is that is something that Robin found out over the course of her time in America, and that brought her closer to her mother. But that afterward, oh my God, I was like, let me just go sit down and cry. Like, this is too much. She had to forgive her mother in a way that she was never. How do you forgive somebody if nobody's ever said they're sorry, kind of thing? And I was like, oh, this is just too much. Amazing stuff.
I think like she had to understand her mother's motives. And I think this story is different from a lot of immigrant stories we read too, because I think you were saying, Fatema, like Robin leaves behind a life that she really likes. And she, you know, is comfortable and she has no desire to leave it. And she's tricked into leaving it. And so I just think it's later when she goes back to Korea and she understands that the cultural barriers that her mother was facing there, and also knowing more of her mother's stories, that she's able to understand that. But that's where we get the gift, I think, of hindsight in the story, is that Robin's now telling us this is a grown-up, so she can provide that level of understanding. If we didn't get that, I think it would be really difficult to understand why she would forgive her mom.
Well, I also think too, and this was in one of the interviews, was how she's an adult, she's like 38, 40, and she's not married, she doesn't have any kids, and there's no pressure from her mother to do any of those things, like, oh, where are my grandbabies at? So she's sort of like, some of those things that she grew up with, or some of those reasons and like strong personality or beliefs from her mother, like that was how she, and especially what Lucy said, going back to Korea, she was able to see like, oh, my mother was escaping this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, really interesting woman. I want to know more about them.
Yeah. And part of me wondered when I read the afterward about her mom and the permission seeking, and I was like, how much of your truth did you like kind of soften because you knew that you wanted to, like, you knew that you wouldn't put this out into the world without your mother's permission, right? It is a sign of respect, and obviously it shows like the closeness of their relationship, continuing relationship, for her to care that deeply about how her mother would receive it. I also think that it must have been really powerful for her mom to see herself through her daughter's eyes in this way, because there is a lot of respect and understanding and compassion in the way that she portrays her mom. I know like divorced women in a lot of places still have like, there's so much stigma attached to it. And because of that stigma, it makes it really, really hard to restart your life or have a second act or whatever. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that the way she got her second chance was by getting into a relationship with someone else, right? Before like actually realizing, oh, maybe this isn't what I thought it was going to be. Yeah.
A few days ago, there was an article in the New York Times. I couldn't tell if it was slightly bashing millennial parenting styles or just trying to discuss it. Not clear. But it reinforced this important understanding of how parenting changes each generation. And now millennial parents try to be maybe overly communicative with their children, starting from when they're born, like the gentle parenting of trying to talk to them, have them understand what's going on, listening to them, trying to help them communicate their feelings or reactions, especially if they're very little and can't communicate. And that feels like a very direct reaction to what we're seeing here, where Robin's mother just like did not tell her anything, did not try to get her to not try to contextualize, not try to explain what was happening to her. Like Robin's 14. She can probably put two and two together if you explain it to her. It's not like she's 3 and doesn't have doesn't comprehend what stigma is or what moving to America means. And like giving her the opportunity at least to get her affairs in order. And this type of like gatekeeping of information, is not like unique to Robin's mom. It felt like that feels very central to parenting at a certain time. And so when I read this New York Times article, again, like couldn't tell if it was mocking gentle parenting. I was like, examine deep inside why maybe the byproducts of gatekeeping communication don't want that, don't want to perpetuate that. And so Fatema and I will be interviewing Robin next week, I think. On the 23rd. And that's one of the questions I have, not just about her relationship with maybe younger people, but the messages she receives from readers and understanding if this type of communication style has influenced their choices moving forward with other small children in their lives. But yeah, I mean, I have a lot of feelings about over communicating with children. Like my small child is 8 months old and I try to reason with her, not in a power struggle way, but in a, please don't touch my hot tea. There's caffeine and sugar in there. You can't have them yet. Let's wait. And then you can touch it. She's like, doesn't know what I'm talking about.
I think in that style of communication, though, too, you're also rationalizing isn't the right word because it's not like you're trying to create an excuse, but you're also going through and processing the same emotions as your kid is. And obviously, this is your example is one that's lower stakes, but I think there is, and not just parents to children, but person to person. There's something in thinking through why this person is doing this thing that they're doing and why you may not want them to do it, and kind of breaking down those steps. This is a bit of a tangent from the book, but it is amazing how the things that are modeled to you, whether they're modeled to you from your parents or from the book you're reading, the way that they can carry through and impact your life. It's seems like you're setting your kid up for success if you're already doing it now. And being an empathetic person in general, that's always a good thing to practice.
Yeah, I would give a plug for communication, just because now I have a 20-year-old and a 23-year-old who communicate all the time with me because I communicated all the time with them. Whether or not it was the right thing to do, it just, I was young, and so I just told them stuff, but I get it back. So, but along those lines, I would say that I think the thing, and this in thinking about the book too, like with communication between parents and children, is that I think when parents communicate certain things, it helps humanize them to their children. And I think it's easy for kids to forget that your parents are actually people who have thoughts that are separate from you and who have all these sorts of feelings, the same kind of feelings that you have. And so Robin didn't have any idea of like the things that her mother was feeling or going through, then she gets moved to this country and Robin has to go through this shame and isolation and depression and all these things. But because there was this lack of communication, she didn't understand that her mother had any difficult feelings either.
Well, also too, like for the flashbacks in Korea, like it tells stories of some of the terrible things that she was going through because of like the stigma that was attached to her mother, like the teacher that hated her, or like even some of the comments like in the salon, like, bastard child or whatever. So she was being bullied and she was feeling those things, pretty intensely for a small kid there. And her mother was going through her own, set of remarks and bullying and comments because of the way she's chosen to live her life as a single parent. But again, I'm not a great communicator, so I can see that, but also it's like, well, if they would have just sat down and chatted, they would have decided that they were both miserable with the situation. But I mean, that's not what happened. And I am glad that the story had a happy ending, and that, because it could have gone so many ways, but I was not excited about the mom remarried and that whole situation with the siblings. And then he wants to go to California, and I was not pleased with any of that, but what can you do?
Reading the book, I was constantly amazed by the ways they were able to communicate and the ways that they weren't. Like the mom was like, I'm taking you to comic book class. Like she saw that in her daughter and was like, I see you. And I was like, whoa, what an amazing thing. But then when it comes to like playing the piano, it's like, why are you being such a baby? And it's like, if you could see how drawing comics brought so much joy to your child, but you're also stuck in this mode where it's like, you're such a baby, like play the piano for everybody. It's just the ways that you can and cannot see things within one another is endlessly fascinating. And I think illuminates this part of life that I don't usually see illuminated in art.
Well, one of the things that one of the questions that we had written up was, do you think that Robin Howe would have had a similar or even the same kind of immigration experience had she immigrated today, as opposed to when she did with snail mail and all of that?
I think there are some tools that could have helped her, especially with the language, both with, you're right, being able to email with your friends at home, but also with the way that our smartphones can translate. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people will be any nicer, because there's still, even that's still one level of barrier. And sometimes it's obnoxious, takes longer. Sometimes it doesn't do it right. So I'd love to think that, oh yeah, it would be worlds easier. And instead I think it would be a little bit easier. But now I'm spitting it as I'm thinking it, but I also think it might be harder to be with social media and see what all your friends are doing at home right now while you can't be there. And while I know she was also imagining plenty of that, there's something in seeing it and not having it denied. So I don't know, elements would be easier, elements would be harder, but I think kids would still be mean because kids are often thoughtless. And it's just, hopefully most people learn as they get older. But it would still be really hard for her today.
I think the internet helps as much as it hurts. There's something instantaneous about the internet where you can communicate instantly. And you perhaps Robin would receive this rush of happiness. And then I also think the internet is sometimes a place for people to go in and to isolate. And maybe Robin would have found community online that would have been helpful to her, but maybe that would have also prevented her from finding that community outside of the internet. It's a really complicated question.
Yeah. I think that part about like self-isolating because you would still have access to the community you left behind is really True. I know growing up, we didn't have the, quick international calls or anything, right? It was very expensive. So because of that, a lot of people made greater effort to know their neighbors and to build relationships and have connections, right? And I'm speaking again specifically to the Bengali community that I grew up in. But nowadays, like with new immigrants, I don't know that they are as enmeshed with the local community as they are, because WhatsApp makes it very easy for you to stay connected to your family back home. And oftentimes, like, that is your social support system, right? When you're going through a problem, that's who you call and all of that. There's little reason to try to build out outside of that. And I've seen that happen. And I think that that's definitely one of the hindrances of like the technological advances, at least. Yeah. And immigration.
I mean, to that point of how does technology enable or hinder people's loneliness?
Yeah.
There's a critical point where you hit massive diminishing returns. Like, up to a certain point, you can have good social lives on the internet, but there comes a point where you're unable to learn how to have like real social interactions, or you depend fully on your phone or computer to facilitate real human connection. And there is a difference. There's a noticeable difference. And so part of this conversation of like the loneliness epidemic is how many people are, not just because the pandemic was happening before COVID started too, how many people prefer to be online with people, with others, whether it's gaming or being on large groups on Facebook or on just group chats, or spending a lot of their time on forums. Like, that is very different. And it can contribute to this feeling of isolation. Like, so many people at a cursory level, but you don't actually have meaningful relationships with them beyond that. Yeah. Something else I was thinking about with this book is there's small things that I think are really fascinating. At the very beginning of the book, Robin talks about how her and her mom go and travel and how they don't really need, she's like, well, why do I need to learn English? And her mom's like, well, English is spoken everywhere. And remember that time we were in Guam, it helped us there. And she lists that she went to Guam, Hawaii, and a handful of other places. Does not equate Guam or Hawaii as being American. And I thought that was super fascinating. That for many, like most people, even in the US, they don't really see it as white American. And then when she gets to the US or gets to Alabama and she figures out that she's stuck here and has to go to school, her step siblings, not step siblings yet, but they encourage her to pick an American name that they really mean as a white name. And that same mindset, it still is super pervasive. It impacted how my name was chosen. It impacted how we chose my kid's name. That's why there's this limited pool of ethnic names, because it's all catered to what white people feel comfortable with, specifically white people. That is, and it's just all very fascinating how outside of the US, how people perceive what is American.
Yeah. I did like in this book too, how she likes the opportunity to pick a name, because then it's one less thing for her to be like picked on about. And her Korean name, Chuna, is like an old fashioned kind of name. And she didn't want to pick a name. She wanted to pick something that was not as, old fashioned or like a name like that. But then she also picked a general neutral name. But then she also picked a name where she couldn't pronounce the R or the L, or she pronounced the R's like L. So she had to really practice. I thought that was really brave and really cool that like she chose the name she wanted and how she did it. And then picked one that didn't roll off the tongue and she mastered it. She got it. I thought that I just really respected her for that. It's really, I like that a lot.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite little bright spots when she was describing her relationship with her name. And I thought, what a way to quickly tell us when I think the name she said that Chuna is like Gertrude. And the fact that is enough, and that's all she needed to say for us to go like, oh yeah, no, okay, I get why people made fun of you for this. but I do love that she had that. That was like the one bit of agency she had, was picking her name. She didn't get to pick where she went. She didn't get to pick who she was with. But that she got to pick her name, and she picked one that she liked. It felt like such a little victory in a time when she had so few.
I think it's indicative in general too of how empowering it can be to name yourself, for whatever reason that is, whether you're whatever reason you may be renaming yourself, or in this case she's just picking a name that, you know, people will understand more where she's living. But there is something empowering about, like, we don't choose our names, they're given to us, and when you get to make that choice yourself, I think that's empowering.
Yeah, I think it was definitely a boost to her, and going to school and getting used to things. It was definitely a boost of something she could take with her. I also, since she was moving from Korea to here, she had that bit of her identity, you know, being Korean, being American. And then she was also at a certain point of being here and learning more of the culture, more of the language, and getting used to things, was deciding which parts of like Korea she was going to hold and which parts of, you know, America she was going to hold. And she could pick and choose which parts to put in her out in the world. I thought that was really a really cool thing, anyway, to approach it.
Did anyone have thoughts on how the story ended or where it ended?
I just remember that panel where half of it is her face and she's on the phone, and the other half is her mom's face and she's on the phone. And she's like, Korea, like she could way back to Korea, and she was like, oh, Korea's kind of weird too. I'm not sure if I fit in here exactly either. And it's like, if I remember correctly, she's like, oh, it's because I'm Korean American.
Yeah.
I was like, dang. Words fail me. But I was like, dang, okay. Yeah. I see, I get it.
Yeah.
I wanted the book to last longer. I was really enjoying the reading experience. I also was only able to get my hands on quickly the digital version of it, but it meant that I had no, like, it did kind of feel like the story was wrapping up, but I didn't have the page numbers or seeing the thickness of the book. And I know you can like tap the screen and see where you're at in an ebook, but I just decided not to. And so we were reaching that point where it was naturally wrapping up, and I was like, oh man, I guess I'm done. And it was kind of a similar experience I had with, and maybe I'm comparing them because I also just read The Magic Fish, maybe right before, right after. I don't even remember which order I read, but it was a similar experience with that book where I was like, I'd really love more, but it's being wrapped up at the right time. That being said, like I said at the beginning, if she were to write another volume of what her young adulthood or adulthood is like, I'd buy it. I'd like to read it. I like her art. I'm interested in her story. But I don't know if that's something she plans on doing.
We can ask.
I also think the ending too just sets her in a really good place. It leaves you with such a sense of hope of her like coming to accept who she is, what she's not, what she is, and then just kind of like I could picture almost a still of somebody. Maybe this was in another book maybe it was in The Magic Fish. Oh, Lucy, this was in Hoops. Wasn't there something with the guy's foot that was in one cell and would go to move through time?
Yeah.
And so for me, I was envisioning like her stepping to the next, you know, she says, I'm ready to come home. There's a really good note because you spend so much of the book, like, and you learn a lot of story, and like, it's a slim book. It's very few. I can't imagine trying to like edit the stories and then edit the amount of cells and how much you put in each cell, like word wise, as well as language wise, as well as details and things that are within the cell and to back it up. But then to also like, how do you know, where do you take the story? Like how many bad stories do you tell? How many like positive moments do you have of her becoming used to her new city and her new life? And then to end on such a positive note, I like that too. I still want to know what the mom thinks. Because she like it's half of her and half her mom. And she's like, well, maybe if I would have stayed in Korea, I would have left as an adult too. It's a good way to end. Like you close the book and you're thinking. Like when you close the book and you're like thinking and nodding, and that's always a great ending.
The part that really, I guess, stood out to me about the end is I was really happy that she was able to go back to Korea and to reconnect with her childhood friends that she'd kind of been ripped away from, even though she's able to, write letters and things. But then as they're talking, she eventually realizes that they are in very, very, very different places, and that they probably don't have futures together because they're in such different places. And that made me really sad, because it was something I could relate to. But it sounded like she was able to leave Korea in a good place. But that just struck me as so sad. It was very final of like, well, I went back, I reconnected with my friends, and then I realized we can't be friends anymore.
Yeah.
So there's actually a movie coming out called Past Lives. It releases in like 3 weeks. Stars Greta Lee, Ateo Yo, and John Magaro. And it feels very similar to this, where it's about Korean American who immigrates from Korea as a young girl, and comes back and reconnects with her childhood best friend, and it's a man, and they're figuring out what does this friendship look like as she's come back as they're adults, and her relationship to space, place, and him. So it feels like kind of in conversation with this book as well. It probably isn't explicitly, but very similar themes. So I'm personally really excited for this. It's being released by A24, who did Everything Everywhere All at Once. There we go.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, this seems like a natural ending point in the conversation. Really appreciate everyone reading with us and sharing your thoughts. Like it's always, these discussions always brighten up my month. Next month, we're reading Names for Light, A Family History. I don't know much more than that about it because I haven't read it yet. So yeah, I think it'll be good. Cool.
Well, thank you once again for leading such a great discussion and for providing us with such good reading material. We just get such a diverse range of books to read with you, and it's always enjoyable. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.